A Liberty Seguros agora é Yellow. Tudo aquilo que já era bom continua igual. Excelência e proximidade permanecem como nossa essência. Porque não é uma mudança, é uma evolução. A Yellow está sempre em sintonia com você. É liberdade com segurança. A melhor experiência acessível a todos os clientes, iluminando cada passo da sua jornada. Deixe essa luz iluminar seu caminho. Yellow Seguradora. Seguro para viver livre. Consulte seu corretor.
RH, quer saber como voar no trabalho? É só usar a Flash. Com a Flash, você concentra toda a gestão de pessoas em um único lugar. Faça a admissão dos colaboradores e solicite mais de 8 categorias de benefícios. Ah, e você ainda pode fazer todo o controle de ponto. Conheça o novo onboarding integrado da Flash em flashapp.com.br.
A lot of talk about garbage in the American election. We're less than a week until the Americans decide who's going to be their next president, and the discussion is about garbage. Hello, welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. I'm Brian Lilley, your host. Maybe you heard about Donald Trump's rally at Madison Square Gardens in New York over the weekend. He had a comedian open it up, Tony Hinchcliffe, who's a bit of a roast comedian, who's said nasty things about everyone he has ever been interacting with, if you watch this guy. And here's what he said about Puerto Rico that has an awful lot of people outraged.
You know, there's a lot going on. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
So that comment, Puerto Rico's a floating island of garbage, that had everyone saying, oh, Trump, just more proof that he's racist. This Madison Square Garden thing's just a Nazi rally. It's horrible. How dare he say those things? Well, here's George Lopez, the comedian and sitcom star, at a Democrat rally talking about how you better not leave building supplies around for the border wall or Mexicans will steal it.
Donald Trump said he was going to build a wall, and George Lopez said, you better build it in one day, because if you leave that material out there overnight.
So those are two comedians at various events, and you can dismiss them and say, well, they're just comedians. But here's Joe Biden, the current president, the current Democrat president of the United States, jumping into this and saying Trump supporters are garbage.
And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico where I'm in my home state of Delaware. They're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
Some media outlets are now trying to downplay that and say, well, that's not really what Joe Biden said. No, he clearly said Trump supporters are garbage. Is this where we're at in the last dying days of the American election? Joining me now to talk more about this, to break it all down, is a man who has no love for either candidate and no love for the hypocrisy of either side, JD Tuccille. You may read him in National Post. And JD, I'm going to take a quick guess. You may invoke Mercutio from Romeo and Juliet and say a plague on both your houses. Am I wrong?
Yes, by and large, I think that it's so appropriate that at a time when American politics have turned into basically a dumpster fire floating down a river of sewage, that our political parties are literally going to garbage. I mean, it's just amazing. This is ridiculous. First of all, the Republicans should know that if you hire an insult comic as your opening act for a rally, you're going to get insults, and that means somebody's going to get roasted. That's just what Tony Hinchcliffe does, and it's what he delivered at the Madison Square Garden. George Lopez, of course. I mean, people have been making fun of each other over every difference forever, and if you have a sense of humor about yourself, that's a good thing. But when Lopez is almost simultaneously making fun of Latinos also, okay, it's probably taken a little of the sting out of the Hinchcliffe joke. The worst one, honestly, and this is where Democrats repeatedly cannot get out of their own way, is when the President of the United States refers to the supporters of the main opponent of his party's candidate as garbage. It's being billed as yet another deplorables moment, although in a lot of ways it's even worse.
Cleaners, deplorables, You can go down the list. There is this tendency on the Democratic side to say, well, not only is my opponent wrong on the policy, but they're wrong morally. They're just bad people. And I don't think that helps you with the general electorate. Look, elections are decided, whether you like it or not. Elections are decided by swing voters. Now, I remember there was a quote from Ann Coulter more than a decade ago where she said that if you're a swing voter at this point, you've basically got the IQ of a toaster. But swing voters decide elections in your country and mine. And so those are the people you're appealing to, not the hardcore partisans. The hardcore partisans you try and whip up. But you've got to appeal to the swing voters. And if your side is saying, well, anybody that would even consider the other side is morally inferior, well, then you're telling those people that are saying, I don't know, do I want to vote Trump? Do I want to vote Harris? You're telling them that even just by considering voting Trump, you're morally inferior.
That's exactly right. Our politics have hardened into about 40% being rock solid supporters of either of the major parties, no matter what they do. There's a few percent in between that will vote for one of the smaller parties and independent candidates, and then there are some persuadables in there. So the parties really in our elections are fighting over about 5, 6, 8% of the electorate. That's all that's available to the two parties, and that's what's going to decide the election. And the sides are so hardened that the party and they despise each other. Let's be clear now. When they ask Democrats what they think of Republicans,
wait a minute.
Absolutely.
They despise each other?
They despise each other. When you ask them, when you ask surveys, how would you refer to a Republican if you're a Democrat? How would you refer to a Democrat if you're a Republican? A majority, or at least half, and often a majority, will refer to the other side as a threat to democracy, as dangerous, as immoral. So the sides are not just hardened, but the really negative opinions of the sides are hardened, and that's where you get your deplorables moments when candidates refer to supporters of their main opponent as disgusting people, as garbage, as deplorable, because they know they're not winnable. That 40% of the electorate is not available to them, and that stirring up the pot like that, vilifying them, is an effective way of getting out their own electorate. But it also hardens the sides. It makes that divide deeper. It makes the tensions worse, and it makes the politics zero sum. And at the end of the day, one side wins, and they're going to punish the other side when they're in power.
So, but the comments from Tony Hinchcliffe were widely played by most of the media, and they were denounced. And you've got this claim that the fact that Trump just rallied at Madison Square Gardens is proof that he's a fascist, that he's a Nazi. And they keep pointing back to this, was it the 1939 or early 1940s rally at Madison Square Gardens? Look, Madison Square Gardens is the home to an awful lot of things. New York Rangers, I believe, still play there. You've got concerts going on there. Billy Joel. Is Billy Joel a Nazi? Because he has played there more than any other artist, I believe. He's basically had a monthly residency. And then when you look at politics, show me a party in any era that has not rallied at Madison Square Garden. So beyond the fact that some lunatics on MSNBC or MSLSD, as Mark Levin calls it, I don't think wrongly, why were people saying that this was a Nazi rally? You can dislike Trump as much as you want, but calling him a fascist and a Nazi when it's not warranted. Eric Adams, the New York mayor, said that was wrong. What were they basing this on other than, well, Nazis were there in 80 years ago, so therefore he's a Nazi? Was there any meat there, or was this just inflated BS?
No, this is the hot dumpster fire again of American politics. First of all, to clarify, 85 years ago, the German-American Bund had a rally at the Madison Square Garden, a building that no longer exists. That Madison Square Garden was torn down in the 1960s. The current Madison Square Garden is not in the same place, and it was built in 68, I think it opened. So it's not even the same building. However, in the new one, Bill Clinton had a rally.
But I mean, in that old one, That's where Marilyn Monroe sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President"
Yeah,
to JFK.
it's not even the same building.
Is
Well,
JFK a
apparently in
Nazi?
American politics, everybody's either a Nazi or a communist. And the problem with doing that is there's no place to go. If a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the election, your opponent is a fascist and a Nazi, you're not leaving yourself a lot of room to double down and really dig in with the claims. Where do you go from there? Cannibal? That's about all that's left. And really, that's how substance-free American politics is now. Now, first of all, if you want to be literal about this stuff, the fascist actually applies to the economic policies of both the major parties now. You know, private ownership nominally, but state control, state directed through industrial policy. Both the parties are endorse that. That's what the Democrats have enacted, and it's what Republicans are promising, especially J.D. Vance. So if you want to talk about fascist, they're both fascist.
Look, I would argue that neither one of them goes as far as someone like a Mussolini. And I think you would agree with that, but there is an awful lot of accusations being thrown around here, and I look at it and I say, how does this help anyone decide who to vote for?
It's not, but it helps you if they want to help people decide who to vote against. This isn't really about persuading people to vote for a candidate. It's about making the other candidate untouchable. Socially unacceptable to vote for, unacceptable to support in any way. At this point, you're trying to peel off a percent or two. This is a 50-50 race. It is a coin toss race. It went from a very slight advantage for Kamala Harris about a month ago to a very slight advantage for Donald Trump right now going into Election Day. So if you could peel off, if you could just dissuade a few people from voting for your opponent, then maybe you can edge across that finish line next Tuesday. That's what this is about. No one's actually trying to run especially, honestly, Kamala Harris is not trying to run a positive campaign, persuading people to her side. She's just trying to dissuade people from voting for Donald Trump.
Oh, I thought her campaign was all about joy.
Yeah, that lasted about 5 minutes, and then we went to fascist. And the problem here is that, honestly, I'm not a fan of either of these candidates, but Kamala Harris is very overtly an empty suit. She's a vacuous sociopath. And to be fair, let me call Trump a narcissistic bully, so we got all the terms out there. But she's a vacuous sociopath who is a vehicle for the aspirations of the people around her. That's honestly, there's kind of a committee that's been making decisions for Joe Biden as president, according to the Wall Street Journal. They reported that before he dropped out of the race. And I would assume that those are the same people who are generally guiding Harris now, because she's never been known throughout her career for reading her briefing papers or making hard decisions. So this is not a campaign that's going to have substance to it, because there's not a substantial candidate to run that campaign. So all you can go with is empty slogans and vibe. I mean, for about 10 minutes, we had a vibe campaign going. That didn't last long either. Now, the Joy campaign, Brat Summer.
It'd be a Brat
Summer. That was at least somewhat upbeat, which was nicer than throwing around accusations.
Well, until you look up what brat would mean on the Urban Dictionary, and then you're like,
these people are not exactly in tune with current youth culture either. So that's where you end up with your embarrassing moments. Say Tim Walz playing a video game to a 0-0 tie, trying to win over voters while they're actually watching football instead of his video game. It's just a substance-free campaign, and it's really kind of awful to watch. It's like watching a dumpster fire, and the thing is, we have to live with the results of this after next Tuesday. One of these two is going to be the next president of the United States, and they're going to exercise their power over policy. They wield vast authority of the office of the presidency, and we're going to have to live with the fact that neither of these two has a decent claim to being up to the job.
Look, I told you the last time we spoke about the American election. As a Canadian, I sit here and I go, okay, you're both protectionist. I'm not happy with either one of you. Although I will say, and I made this comment on another podcast recently, Harris is actually worse for us, especially where I live here in Ontario. We've got a large part of the auto industry entirely integrated with the American auto industry, whether it's in Michigan, Ohio, whether it's in West Virginia, like the parts that go back and forth between the various regions. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have both tried to repatriate or patriate the entire auto industry back to Michigan. They want it in Michigan, and they want it in unionized shops. And had it not been for Joe Manchin and the two Democrat senators out of Georgia, where they've got auto plants that are not unionized, that would have passed. And the entire Canadian auto industry, which has grown up, like it's not like we stole jobs from you. The fact is that the auto industry grew up in the Great Lakes Basin on both sides of the border at the same time and have benefited from each other. But Biden in 2008, 2009 tried to take all the jobs south during the fiscal meltdown, and he tried to do it with the Inflation Reduction Act. And Kamala Harris was a big part of that. So, yeah, people will point to Trump. He had tariffs on steel and aluminum. Yeah, those bug me. But so do the tariffs on softwood lumber that make your homes more expensive. So does the idea that we'll put in all kinds of Buy American policies so that we can't trade back and forth. All of these things bug me. So I'm not a big fan of either candidate, but objectively, the Democrat team is now worse than the Republican team in terms of protectionism. And that's going on. But let's stick with the media thing before we leave that, because you wrote a great piece for National Post the other day. Just want to read the headline off and then part of it. Edited Harris 60 Minutes interview shows why many have lost faith in the media. Shedding audience and credibility, organizations that should inform the public disdain it instead. Okay, I'm going to feign ignorance, JD. I'm not going to feign it. I'm going to say it. Like, I've followed this on the margins. I know what it's like to do TV interviews, radio interviews, podcast, print. You can screw it up an awful lot of ways, but it takes effort. What did 60 Minutes do that leaves you saying this hurts the entire media sector?
Yeah, this was amazing. I mean, they put this on public display. They had 60 Minutes had a sit-down interview with Kamala Harris. And in the teaser for the interview, they had a question for her about whether Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, was listening to the Biden administration anymore about Israel's response to the attack by Hamas. And her response in the teaser sounded like she dropped her Scrabble board. It was a mess. It was words garbled together without meaning. In the actual interview, when they aired 60 Minutes, she came out with a rather more coherent answer to the same question. And so a lot of people watched the two. The teaser was broadcast by CBS, and then so was the interview. We're like, okay, which was the actual answer to that question? And we want to see the transcript, and even better, how about the raw footage so we can see what her actual answer was? CBS has been hemming and hawing, has refused to release the transcript or the raw footage, which they did, by the way, when one of the reporters interviewed Donald Trump back in 2017, I think it was actually. Catherine Herridge was the reporter. She no longer works for CBS, but she came out and pointed that out and then linked to the full transcript of the interview that they put out. So that was clear that they weren't just editing it to make him look good or bad. And she asked, as many people do, that CBS did the same thing with Harris, and they've refused to do that. It's an awful look, which could have been cleared up immediately by them saying, you know what? Here's the full transcript. We just released two different parts of her answer at different times. But here's exactly what she said in full. That would have resolved the problem. But this is a self-own. The media has been doing it to itself over and over again by becoming a partisan player in American politics. And this is not the first time by any means this has happened. They erode their credibility. They erode their trust. And now, of course, we're at a point where when you ask people, do you trust the media? More people say they have no faith at all in the U.S. news media than say that they have high faith in it.
And look, I can understand editing for time. Although when I do big sit-down interviews, my goal is always, and I believe in every case, whether it's online or somewhere, we have released the full interview. And I've done interviews with prime ministers, opposition leaders, premiers. And okay, if you don't air the full thing on a radio show or a TV show because of time constraints, the whole interview goes online. And people can see the full thing. But maybe you say, okay, well, we've only got 7 minutes that we can show, and you talked for 15. Put the full 15 minutes online. Let people view it. Let people say it. The fact that the teaser had the word salad and and then what they broadcast had the coherent answer. That really does make them look bad. It'd be better if they just cut out the entire question and answer, wouldn't it?
They would have, although I think that whether or not a presidential candidate has the ability or inability to answer a question clearly is something that's of interest to the audience. And if the actual answer is word salad or partially word salad, that should be available. In a couple of places in that same interview, they summarized her answer. They had a voiceover to summarize it because they said the answer was too long to put on air. Well, is that true or was it just a bad answer? Again, server space is not that expensive. The internet makes things possibly much more open and transparent. So put the full answer up online, put the raw footage and or the transcript up online, as they've done in the past with other candidates, and let people see for themselves what this candidate actually said. After all, you're interviewing someone who wants to be a president of the United States and have had control over nuclear weapons and the ability to shape policy. That's a lot to ask. So let's vet them. Let's vet them in full.
So let me ask you about Donald Trump going on with Joe Rogan. This is an offer that was made to both candidates. Joe Rogan offered to do an interview with Donald Trump, which happened last week. He offered to do one with Kamala Harris. Harris decided to say no. Trump's interview just on YouTube has been seen by 40 million people. Now, if you know YouTube stats, some of that is people watched for 30 seconds. Some people watch for the entire time. But those are staggering numbers. And then you know that Rogan has a specific deal with Spotify. His podcast shows up elsewhere. There's all kinds of clips on social media. This is one of the most widely watched interviews. And let me just scroll down. It is a 2-hour, 58-minute, in 50-second interview. They offered the same thing to Harris. She declined. Then they offered 1 hour, but he'd have to fly to her instead of her going to his studio. Was that a wise decision on the Harris campaign's part? They are struggling with men at the moment. Donald Trump goes on and speaks for 3 hours, effectively. And you can pick apart his answers or not, but fairly coherent for the entire time. And there's no editing, so you can see everything. And then Harris says, well, if you fly to us, we'll give you 1 hour. I think she should have gone on with that.
I think she should have too. And the fact is that demanding that he fly to her, bring his portable studio, which may or not actually exist, and interview her for 1 hour when his format is longer, that's rich. First of all, the media does not serve at the sufferance of politicians. If they want to hold office, they go and they ask for special favors. And being interviewed on a major show is a favor. So you go there. It's her job. Yeah.
And that's bigger. I mean, just so people realize, that's bigger than any cable news program. That's bigger than any major, ABC, NBC,
it is.
CBS.
The viewership, the listenership is huge. And again, I want to emphasize this: the media does not serve politicians; they serve the public. So if she has to go to the mountain, she has to go to Rogan if she wants to be on the show. He owes her nothing. But it was not wise. If you have a competent candidate who can access that huge an audience, the thing is, she should jump at it. She should fly to Austin, and then she should go on the show, and she should make her case. And yes, Trump talked with Rogan for 3 hours, and apparently they got along, and apparently it impressed a lot of people. At least that's the impression you get from the interview, and then from the reactions after the interview. I think the big concern, and it's always been a concern, is that Harris is not capable of speaking unscripted for 10 minutes, let alone for 2 or 3 hours. She's not good at that. She comes off as forced, unnatural. She loses her place. The famous word salads start coming out. So if you have a competent candidate, which is someone they should have tested for and vetted for months ago, then this is an extremely poor decision, is to not go on the Joe Rogan show because of the vast audience you can reach through that, an audience that she needs, largely young men. But if you have what we all suspect is a not very good candidate who cannot think on her feet and cannot speak unscripted, then this was a necessary decision. But that reflects very poorly on Kamala Harris.
All right, JD, I got to take a quick break. When we come back, though, I do want to ask you about your home state in Arizona. I just spent a bit of time there. It's one of the swing states that I think is going to flip for Trump. And there was one interesting stat that I came across when I'm down there. I want to ask you about, and in detail, like, why are swing states going? Because here in Canada, you listen to most of the pundits. How could anyone ever vote for one candidate? Of course, everyone's got to vote for Harris, but why would anyone ever vote for the other guy? It's a binary choice. You and I are in the same boat, but why would anyone do that? Well, we'll talk about that when we come back. So folks might know that I spent a week in mid-October in Arizona. It was part of a travel junket. I'm going to be honest, it was a travel junket. It was fantastic. I went down and toured Route 66, hit Oatman, Kingman, Williams, Flagstaff, Metropolitan, Holbrook, everyone. Put your hands together. But of course, being a political junkie, while I'm down there, I'm paying a lot of attention to what's going on the scene. Now, joined today on the podcast by JD Tuccille. And JD, for people that know Arizona, you're near the Sedona area, correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay, so there's parts of Arizona that always vote Democrat, and there's parts that always vote Republican. And I went through both. I visited Flagstaff. Maybe you've heard. Big Harris area. I visited Oatman. You won't be surprised. They're going to go for Trump. And then you've got swing areas. So 2016, the entire state because it's a winner-take-all state on the Electoral College, the state goes for Trump. 2020, they go for Biden. What was the difference? Maricopa County, where you've got Phoenix and Mesa and Chandler and all these, urban places. It looks like your state's going to go for Trump this time. And Maricopa County is back to being on the red side. Not hugely solidly red, but enough to flip it for him. And I'm looking around and saying, okay, well, what changed? What was going on in 2016 that made them vote for Trump? Why'd they vote Biden in 2020? And why would they go for Trump now? And there was one stat that jumped out. First off, I'm talking to people across the state, and everyone's saying the economy sucks. And, it's the same thing up here. The politicians say, oh, no, we have a study from this alphabet group that says we're doing great. And people say, yeah, but my groceries are more expensive. So you got that going on. But there was this one stat that jumped out at me. House prices in Phoenix area went up 47% in 4 years. Fairly or unfairly, people blame the government, right?
Yeah, and it is fairly. That is blame the government should take. Look, the cost of living since Biden-Harris administration took office, has gone up, according to the government's own statistics, by about 21%. But there are some things that have increased even more, and building supplies. Also, regulatory barriers to building, all of the green rules. It becomes much more difficult. It takes longer and becomes more expensive to build new homes. We have a shortage in this country. I was reading statistics, I think last week, that said we need 3 to 3.5 million homes that we don't have right now. And building them is more expensive now in terms of sourcing the materials. The last few years, some of it was the disruptions of the pandemic and the worldwide lockdowns and such, but a lot of it is new regulatory interference, things that have made it more difficult and more expensive to build homes, but also just to live. There's a feeling among a lot of people that the government is kind of waging war on its own population outside of the urban areas on the coasts. And you can feel that on the ground here in Arizona.
I mean, one of the things that we've got going on here in Ontario, where all of your issues, they sounded very familiar. But, we've got issues like development charges. And those are what the municipality looks at and says, okay, well, you're putting in a new subdivision. Well, we need to put in roads. We need to put in sewers. We need to put in water lines. And those have gone up astronomically over the last bunch of years. And you get the feeling that, okay, you're not just covering costs anymore. This is a money-making center. You don't want to raise property taxes. So you're going to make the person buying the new home. In some areas, it's gone from 39,000 to 200,000 within a decade. That's insane, and that's unsustainable, and it makes homes unaffordable. So, is that sort of thing happening where you are?
Yeah, there's an anti-growth ideology in the current administration. It's deeply wedded with a lot of the green beliefs. The idea that we should just kind of sustain, coast along on what we have, not build more, and discourage increased, building and the use of open land.
Okay. Hold on.
Yeah.
Hold on. I got to stop you there, because the same thing's happening here, and yet the same people that want no growth also believe in open borders and unlimited immigration. How do you reconcile those two? Oh, we shouldn't build any more homes, no more infrastructure, no more roads, but bring in 1.2 million people a year to an area of 15 million people.
Well, they're not reconcilable. And to be clear, I'm not a put the wall up and close the borders kind of a human protectionist.
Yeah, neither am I. But you've got to, if you're going to bring people in, you've got to build stuff.
You've got to build stuff. You have to have a policy for integrating them into your society. You've got to make it possible for them to work. You can't just let them in as refugees and say, no, but you can't get a job. You've got to have actual policy, a pathway to becoming a resident and then eventually a citizen. And yes, you have to build homes for them. If you're going to grow your population, if you're going to let people in, there has to be places to live. You have to build and construct apartments and houses. You have to have jobs. You have to let them integrate into society. And that is not the case. We have a lack of policy now that's just a hot mess, where people come in with unclear status, stay without real legal right to work, and don't really have places to live. So they crowd into apartments, and it makes everybody unhappy. And that, of course, breeds tensions, and it's just a disaster across the board.
One of the things that shocked me when I was down there, I was up around the Williams area, and Trump was holding a rally just south of there in a place that you guys mysteriously call Prescott. It's spelled Prescott. I don't know what's wrong with you. But you guys pronounce it Prescott. Anyway, Trump went in and he went hard on immigration. And if you listen to a lot of our media, that would turn off all Latinos, and all Latinos would say, no, we're never going to vote for Trump. And then I'm looking at some of the polling, and the polling showed that, so this is a statewide poll in mid-October by the American Association of Retired Persons. Hispanic and Latino voters in that poll favored Trump over Harris by a margin of 47 to 45%. Now, a New York Times Siena poll at the same time said Harris had the lead, but Trump still had 40% of Latino voters. He's gone hard on immigration. Talk to me a bit about that, because Arizona has a large Latino population, not a large Black population, not a large diversity in other areas, but Latino, there is a large Latino population, and a good chunk of them are looking at Trump. Explain that to people who live in Canada or on the east and west coast of the United States who say, how does that happen?
Oh, absolutely. Arizona is heavily Hispanic, heavily Latino. And the thing is, when we call Latinos out as if they're a separate group, they're Americans. I mean, it's like saying, and they've become integrated into the society, and to the point where you walk down the street and you can see people who look very Hispanic, but they don't speak Spanish. But you look at people who don't look very Hispanic and they're fluent in Spanish. It's just an amalgam of people in this state where it's with the Hispanic community which predates the Anglo community here, is well integrated into society. They just think of themselves as American because they are. So when you talk about border walls and controls, to a large extent, they don't hear Latinos being called out and targeted. They hear immigrants being called out and being targeted. And they don't think of themselves necessarily as connected to that, even if they still visit relatives in Mexico or Guatemala. They think of people who are trying to come across the border illegally, unlike they did, as being the targets of that kind of policy.
Well, And they probably think of these Venezuelan gangs as being a threat because they are Venezuelan gangs. Or, prior to the Venezuelan gangs being the big issue, it was MS-13. I mean, we've got MS-13 here in Toronto. They are an actual concern. And if you're not worried about organized crime from whichever ethnic group coming in and trying to wreak havoc in society, then you're not paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. My son goes to college in Tucson, which isn't far from the border, and Tucson's got a big gang problem. In fact, there was a young man was shot outside of his dorm about 3 weeks ago. It was just a fight over a basketball game. It's stupid, but it's that's the kind of thing that people worry about, especially with the influx. And you've had a problem with the new gangs coming in from Venezuela. Before that, it was the Salvadorans. You mentioned MS-13. And that's because, well, to a large extent, the people that Venezuela sent north. And I have a friend who's a Venezuelan refugee, but she got out on her own when she could. Venezuela did what Cuba did 60 years ago, which is to flush out their prisons and send them north. So we end up with inheriting their crime problems, which was to a large extent the intent of Maduro.
When Trump says that they're emptying out their prisons and their asylums and sending them north, is that hyperbole or is that reality?
To a certain extent, it's true, and it's not unprecedented. Castro did that with Cuba a long time ago. I mean, if you've got prisons and your economy is collapsing and you're having a hard time feeding your own people, let alone your prisoners, and you've got an enemy, why not send your prisoners to the enemy to be taken care of? So Maduro, to a certain extent, has fed quite a stream of ex-cons or current cons into the people coming north, made it possible for them to come here. So no, it's not all Venezuelans by any means. But is that part of the problem? Yes, it is.
We've seen Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, others go out and give speeches and say that if you're not voting for Kamala Harris, you're part of the problem. Barack Obama specifically targeting black men. Donald Trump holding events with cameras where he goes into black barbershops. There's a lot of race politics going on. I wish I could say that this was not the case. It's just different race politics here in Canada. How is that playing out? Who's winning? Who's losing? A lot of concern that black men will not vote for Kamala Harris. Is Donald Trump going to take? Is he going to win the black male vote, or is he at least going to take enough that he causes problems for Harris?
Yeah, this has been an interesting evolution in Trump and the Republican Party. Back in 2016 and then again in 2020, I think the Trump campaign was, at the very least, borderline racist and crossed that line more than a few times. It was definitely xenophobic. There was something awful about it if you listen to it. He seems to have hit his stride, though. His message has become much more positive and inclusive. Whichever advisors he's listening to now are a better batch than the ones he had in 2016 and 2020. And I think it makes it easier for him to reach across lines that in the past he kind of reinforced, racial, ethnic, linguistic lines. And he's reaching along those lines much more effectively than is the Harris campaign. And that is why you're seeing these numbers drifting in his direction among Hispanics in particular, but also among blacks and Asians. So the Trump campaign is running a more positive and more inclusive campaign, much to my surprise this time around, than it did in the past, and a much more inclusive campaign than Harris is running. So that's why you end up with Harris sending these proxies out, trying to shame groups that previously voted overwhelmingly Democratic into sticking to their own voting patterns, which they're not doing anymore because they're being courted by a candidate they find more attractive.
Now, men overall, the Harris campaign's having trouble with. You've seen some of the ads. Now, I thought the ads were cringeworthy in terms of, I'm a man. I don't mind snuggling on the couch. I don't know. It felt overwrought. And I thought, look, there are a pile of Democrats in flyover country, as they might call it, in the middle of America where the battle's being fought. They could have talked to regular Democrats, just regular dudes who vote Democrat, and asked them about it. But these ads that the Harris campaign put out trying to attract men felt a colleague of mine said, "Oh no, they're all tongue in cheek," and I said, "Okay, well, I'm not getting that. I'm getting, what the hell are you thinking?" So, uh, what? How do you see that playing out in this? The Harris campaign has trouble with men. They put out these ads that make most men, in my view, say, "I don't know, that's just kind of weird." Does she have trouble with men? Women are pretty evenly split. Men lean a little bit more to Trump than Harris, and in a race as tight as this, that matters.
It matters a huge amount, and no, these are not tongue-in-cheek ads. These are clueless ads. This is a marker of the divide in American politics now, as the Republican Party has become a populist entity, and the Democratic Party has become an elitist entity. And as the Democratic Party's base becomes increasingly upper middle class, educated, urban, it loses touch with anything outside of that. That's not to say there aren't Democrats out in flyover country, and I live in flyover country, and I know some Democrats.
Well,
but it does mean
your state, by the way, I was about to say province. Oh my goodness, your state is about 49-47 right now. 49 for Trump, just shy of 47 for Harris. Your state is split, and there's a lot of normal dudes who, in your state, would vote for Harris. I think if they watch those ads, they would kind of get a creepy feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I get a creepy feeling watching them. I mean, you're watching cosplay. These are not real people. These are people who put on the flannel. These are people who found a pickup truck, somebody else's pickup truck to sit on. These people are kind of aping a role that they don't fully understand, and it comes through loud and clear in the ads. And that's unfortunate, because if they still had a clue, they could have found still existing blue-collar Democrats, still existing football-watching Democrats who they could have made these ads with, and who had a better feel for this kind of culture. But the party as a whole, the people making these ads, the people planning out and strategizing the campaign, have entirely lost touch as the Democrats have become increasingly elite and urban. And the Republicans, conversely, are increasingly populist and ex-urban to rural. And that's the divide in politics. And it's one that the Democrats in particular seem almost incapable of bridging at this point.
Well, I'll say this for the Harris campaign, and I'd love your thoughts on it. Before Joe Biden stepped down, there were states that should not be battleground states that were becoming battleground states. Virginia was in play. New Hampshire was in play. Minnesota. There's so many places that, because Biden was so weak and the American public was starting to look and say, wow, he's not the guy we elected in 2020. The cognitive decline is real. That's a problem. She closed that, and she has made it a much more competitive race than it would have been if Joe Biden had stepped in. And, whether it's because she has a pulse or is able to, we've discussed that she speaks in word salads. Look, they both do. But she has made it a much more competitive race. And I think she deserves some credit for that on the Democrat side.
Well, she does. I mean, Harris has closed the gap somewhat. I mean, Trump was very clearly going to beat Biden when Biden was still in the race, was still the Democratic candidate. The thing is, though, being not as bad as a walking corpse is a low bar to overcome. And that is, I mean, I'll grant this, the worst candidate the Republicans could have run is Donald Trump. But, I mean, they've got a lot of other talent that will be more credible, that's smarter, that has better handle on policy than Donald Trump does. But the thing is, being less bad than Biden doesn't mean necessarily being better than Trump. She's just competitive with Trump. That's not saying a lot. And that is the sad state of the fact with the two major parties right now. So, yeah, I mean, Virginia's no longer in play. New Hampshire's going to go Democrat. And Virginia would have been shocking if it was in play, because the votes there are now dominated by the Beltway bandits, that area around D.C., which is all dependent upon the national capital. But Harris only slightly improved Democrat chances. They should not have run her as a candidate. She was a poor choice. And there's a very good chance that Biden endorsed her just as an FU after they pushed him out of the race. He made it a done deal, and otherwise they would have had. Yeah,
There's some people that say his comment about Trump supporters being garbage is just another attempt to try and undermine her campaign. Every time Biden does something, there's people saying, there he is trying to undermine Harris's campaign again.
It's possible. I mean, I do think he tried to undermine the Democrats by just overtly endorsing Harris and preventing a quick new primary where they could have chosen a viable candidate. Whether at this point now because he's known for a history of stupid and off the cuff comments, that's not new. So whether he's strategizing that at this point, maybe, I don't know. But the damage is done. The Democrats are running an untested candidate who did not do well the last time she went into a presidential primary. She had to drop out quickly. And by accident, she ended up on the ticket as Biden's running mate back in 2020. They just needed her to kind of fill a slot and be Biden's insurance policy. Now the insurance policy is the candidate, and it's not going especially well.
Top battleground states, according to Real Clear polling, they've got Trump at +1. So Trump leading by 0.6 in Pennsylvania, by 1 in North Carolina, by 2.4% in Georgia, 2.5% in your state of Arizona, 0.6 in Wisconsin. The only good news for the Democrats of late is that in Michigan, Harris is ahead by 0.5%. Until recently, Trump was leading in Michigan. Things aren't looking good.
No, although I do want to point out that of all the polling averages, the Real Clear Politics one gives the best numbers to Trump. The other averages still have Harris slightly ahead. The Hill has her ahead by 0.4%, I think. ABC 538 has her ahead by 1.4% nationally. But we don't run a national presidential campaign. Our campaign is state by state. Mm-hmm. So if you run up the numbers in California and New York, you don't do yourself any favors. You still just win the same number of electoral votes in the college. So you need to get the states, those battleground states. And at this point, the advantage is to Trump. Not a lot. It's still a coin toss. But the last I saw was that Nate Silver was giving Trump a 54% chance of winning the campaign. And ABC 538 was giving a 52% chance. So slight advantage Trump. But really, we could wake up on Wednesday morning next week and find either one. Probably not that early, to be honest. Probably 2 weeks later. But find out that either one of them is won.
Well, and the betting averages are putting it a bit higher than Nate Silver. And look, I have a lot of respect for Nate Silver, but I believe he was the guy that said Hillary had a 95% chance of winning in 2016, and she didn't. So he misread the polls then. But betting averages are close to 60% for Trump winning. We've got a few days to go. We'll see how it plays out, but it's looking like it's going towards Trump. Let me ask you about the VP. VP is the job that you get when they want you to disappear. Kamala Harris disappeared for 3.5 years until she helped oust Joe Biden. But she's selected Tim Walz. Donald Trump selected J.D. Vance. Both of them confused me with their vice presidential picks. I didn't see what either one of them added. And then I watched their respective conventions, and, J.D. Vance's book, very impressive. He's done some impressive media interviews over the years. But I watched him at the RNC and I thought, oh, wow, this guy stinks. That was not a good performance. And then Tim Walz comes out and he does pretty well, I thought, at the DNC. And since then, I thought he's done horrible. And J.D. Vance has gotten better. What are your thoughts on the two VP picks, and do they matter? And then I'll ask you, who else Harris should have picked to perhaps help her win.
I agree with you on both counts. I was surprised by both picks. I think that Trump would have been much better off with any of a number of state governors. I think the governor of Virginia would have been a good choice. That would have reached out to a state that he could have won. That would have really made it much better. Nikki Haley would have been a great choice. Reach across to Republicans who didn't want him to be president. J.D. Vance struck me as an odd choice. Tim Walz, his own people hate him. His own state, the population is angry about his COVID policies. He also was never vetted properly, so that was an odd choice.
And he's from Minnesota, a state that the Democrats are going to win no matter what.
Exactly. The candidate that would have made the most sense to me would have been someone like Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. But you're absolutely right. J.D.
Pennsylvania
Vance
is in play right now. And if Josh Shapiro was on the ballot, Pennsylvania, I don't think would be in play.
It might have locked up the election, actually, for Harris because of the electoral votes from Pennsylvania. But J.D. Vance has definitely found his footing. He is aggressive and smart and on the ball in the debates and also in interviews. Walz is not. Walz comes off as phony, forced, and unprepared.
Or perhaps, in his words, a knucklehead.
A knucklehead. And being self-effacing is a good thing, but when that's all you got, that's not going to get you very far. Now, that said, the VP candidates are probably not going to budge the dial very much, except that in Trump's case, Trump's getting old. And there's a fair chance that Vance will have to assume the office of the presidency before Trump finishes out this term if Trump wins the election campaign. So Vance ends up having been a better choice than I expected him to be, even if I would have preferred somebody else. Walz, I think, was just not a good choice and is not providing any benefit to the campaign.
Yeah, I'm really not sure what they're thinking there. I've changed my mind on Vance. I haven't changed my mind on Walz. It'll be a fascinating day, maybe a fascinating week. Maybe it'll be like our province of British Columbia, where a week later, or more than a week later, they're still trying to figure out who won the election. It'll be fun.
I think that's very likely. I do not expect that this is going to be called very quickly. I think it's going to take us a while.
All right, JD, we will continue to read you in the pages of the National Post, and enjoy the nice weather down there in Arizona.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Full Comment is a Postmedia podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. You can subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube. Listen wherever you can. Help us out. Leave us a rating. Give us a review. And tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.